I want to start with something that nobody ever puts in the official reports. Before that shot, before any of it, there was fog. Not metaphorical fog. Not the fog of war that generals love to talk about in their memoirs like it's some poetic tragedy. I mean actual condensation. Actual water vapor. Actual cold, crawling mist rising off the station's cooling vents and drifting across the docking corridor in long, slow fingers. Velthari Station ran hot on the inside because of its reactor configuration, and the moment you opened a bay door to the vacuum-adjacent connector corridors, the temperature differential created this. Fog. Low, ground level, real. I remember standing in it. I remember the fog at my ankles and the railgun across my back and the weight of it. Not the physical weight. I was used to that. But the weight of knowing what I was about to do with it. Nobody talks about the fog. I'm going to. Chapter 1, What the Diplomats Called a Misunderstanding. Source, written testimony, Admiral Yusuf Katak, TDF Command Fleet Vega, submitted 238704001. Let me be precise about the timeline, because there's been a lot of revisionism in the months since Velthari. A lot of people who weren't there saying things like, the humans escalated, or the humans provoked. I want the record to be absolutely clear. The Velthari Station negotiations had been ongoing for 11 months before the first shot was fired. 11 months of what the Galactic Coalition Diplomatic Corps kept calling progress, while the Vithrani Dominion moved 3 additional fleet groups into the Velthari system and parked them in positions that were not, under any reasonable reading of Coalition navigation law, defensive formations. They were siege formations. Every tactical analyst on my staff could see it. I sent 14 separate reports to Coalition Command flagging the positioning. 14. The response I received each time, in slightly varying diplomatic phrasing, was, Admiral Katak, please refrain from characterizing the Vithrani repositioning as hostile in nature, as this complicates the ongoing dialogue process. So that's the context. 11 months, 14 reports. One very patient admiral who was starting to lose his patience. The Vithrani Dominion is not what most people picture when they think of a hostile alien civilization. They're not massive or physically imposing. The Vithrani are, actually, quite small by human standards, roughly 1.5 meters tall, bipedal, with elongated craniums that house a distributed neural network across both the primary and secondary brainstems. They are extraordinarily intelligent. Their technology is, by most measurements, slightly more advanced than ours across most conventional categories. The word most is doing significant work in that sentence. I'll come back to that. What made the Vithrani genuinely dangerous wasn't their technology in isolation. It was their certainty. They had been the dominant military power in the Outer Cygnus Arm for 600 years. 6 centuries of winning. 6 centuries of other civilizations backing down, paying tribute, signing treaties on Vithrani terms. They had a phrase for it, Velthar Khan, which translated roughly as the natural order reasserting itself. When they pushed, things moved. That was the natural order. Then they met us. Not human explorers, not diplomats, not traders or scientists or first contact ambassadors with open hands and careful language. They met us at Velthari because by the time they decided to actually press the Velthari territorial claim with military force, the TDF had already been garrisoning the station for 8 months. 1,700 soldiers, 3 cruisers, 2 frigates. 1 carrier group running rotating patrols. And me. The Vithrani General, Supreme Field Commander Orith Vaughn, transmitted his first official demand on day 1 of what became the siege. Standard territorial reclamation language. Legal framework citing pre-coalition territorial surveys. The usual architecture of a demand that expects compliance. I read it carefully. Then I read it again. Then I drafted a response, had it reviewed by my JAG team, refined it slightly, and transmitted it back. It said in its entirety, Velthari Station is a registered Terran Defense Force installation under Coalition Charter Article 7, Section 3. We are not leaving. Please transmit any further territorial claims through the Coalition Arbitration Office. Admiral Y. Kodak TDF Command Fleet Vega. That was when Orith Vaughn realized this was going to be different. Chapter 2, The Shields. Source, Combat Engineering Debrief, Master Sergeant Theodora Wren, TDF 14th Engineering Brigade, submitted 23870-328. Before I talk about the Battle of Velthari, I have to explain Vithrani shields. Because if you don't understand what those shields meant, what they represented to the Vithrani, psychologically, doctrinally, culturally, then nothing that happened afterward makes any sense. Vithrani shield technology was called the Velshoth in their language, direct translation, the untouched surface. It had been their primary defensive system for approximately 240 years. The core mechanism was a series of overlapping coherent energy fields generated by paired projectors mounted at regular intervals across any vessel's hull. Each field layer operated on a slightly different oscillation frequency. The effect was that energy-based weapons, which, as of 2387, represented roughly 83% of all offensive military technology in the outer Cygnus arm, were absorbed, diffused, and dissipated before they could make meaningful contact with the hull beneath. This worked extraordinarily well. Against almost everything. The Velshoth had been tested in combat against Grethani plasma cannons, Sorvathi particle lances, Kelhari EMP bursts, Dominion-class photon torpedoes, and 17 other categories of directed energy weapon that various civilizations had attempted to use against Vithrani vessels over 2.5 centuries. The shield had never failed. Not once. In 240 years, no weapon had penetrated it. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 240 years of invulnerability. 240 years of watching other civilizations fire their best weapons and watching those weapons simply stop, dissolve, become nothing against the Velshoth. That kind of track record doesn't just create tactical doctrine. It creates mythology. By the time the Vithrani arrived at Velthari, their shields weren't just a military asset. They were a statement about the nature of the universe. They were proof that the Vithrani were, as the phrase suggested, untouched. General Vaughn said it out loud in the second round of broadcast communications, not to me specifically, but to the station-wide channel that both sides were monitoring. He said, and I'm reading from the intercept log directly, "Your weapons cannot touch us. This is not a boast. This is physics. This is the reality you inhabit. Choose accordingly." He believed it. That's what I need you to understand. He was not posturing. He was not performing for his troops or for some diplomatic audience. He genuinely, completely, with every cell of his distributed neural network, believed that his shields were impenetrable. He'd never met a railgun. Chapter 3, Gunnery Sergeant DELA REYES. Source, biographical record compiled by TDF Personnel Command, supplemented by personal testimony. De La Reyes grew up in Batangas City, Earth's Western Pacific Administrative Zone. She was the second of 4 children. Her father worked harbor logistics. Her mother taught secondary mathematics. She was, by her own account, a difficult child who broke too many things trying to figure out how they worked. She joined the TDF at 19. Not because of patriotism, particularly. She said this in several interviews, and I believe her. But because the TDF engineering track offered something that nothing else in her immediate world could: access to the most complex machines humanity had ever built. She wanted to understand them. She wanted to know how they worked. She wanted to put her hands on them and feel what they could do. She made gunnery sergeant in 7 years. That's fast. That's very fast. The average TDF promotion timeline for that rank is 11 to 13 years. She did it in 7 because she had a genuinely unusual talent, not just for operating heavy weapons systems, but for reading them. For understanding, in a way that her unit commanders consistently flagged in performance reviews as almost intuitive, the relationship between a weapons platform and its target environment. She could walk into a position, look at a weapon, look at a target, look at the space between them, and tell you things that the targeting computers wouldn't catch for another 30 seconds. She'd been tested on this. It was documented. It was, according to the weapons physics team at TDF Research Command, a combination of exceptional spatial reasoning, an internalized understanding of ballistic and kinetic mechanics acquired through years of hands-on work, and something that the research team eventually just labeled combat instinct, because they didn't have a better scientific term for it. She'd been assigned to the Irmes 8 months before Velthari. She was there because the Irmes was carrying a MK-7 Kinetic Railgun system, one of 4 such systems in active TDF deployment at that time, and the only crew member in the fleet who had logged more than 200 operational hours on the MK. MK-7 was de la Reyes. The MK-7 KRS. Let me tell you about that too. Chapter 4, the MK-7 Kinetic Railgun System. Source, technical overview compiled by TDF Weapons Research, excerpted for historical record. The MK-7 Kinetic Railgun System is not, in any conventional sense, a sophisticated weapon. That's the first thing weapons physicists will tell you. It does not use directed energy. It does not employ exotic particle technology or plasma confinement, or any of the elegant, mathematically intricate systems that have defined military hardware development across most of the Cygnus-armed civilizations. It uses electromagnetism to accelerate a dense metal projectile to extraordinary velocity, and then releases it in a straight line toward whatever you want to destroy. That's it. The projectile is a tungsten carbide alloy rod, 3.2 centimeters in diameter, 94 centimeters in length, with a mass of approximately 26 kilograms. It is machined to tight tolerances. It has no explosive component, no guidance system, no active tracking capability whatsoever. It is a piece of extremely dense, extremely hard metal. The MK-7 accelerates this rod to approximately 8.7 kilometers per second in vacuum conditions. At that velocity, the kinetic energy of the impact is in the range of 982 megajoules. For comparison, a standard Sorvathi plasma lance delivers approximately 200 megajoules of energy per discharge in coherent electromagnetic form. The Velshoth absorbed plasma lances without difficulty. Energy diffusion systems are extraordinarily good at handling coherent electromagnetic energy. But here's what the Vithrani engineers had never fully modeled in their shield simulations, because no civilization in the outer Cygnus arm had used significant kinetic weaponry in over a century. Kinetic penetration is governed by entirely different physics than energy absorption. A coherent energy field can diffuse and redirect electromagnetic waves because the interaction is between fields. It's physics that operates in terms of wave interference, superposition, dissipation. A 26-kilogram tungsten carbide rod, traveling at 8.7 kilometers per second, is not a wave. It's a physical object with mass and momentum, and it wants to keep going in the direction it's going with the energy it has, and the only way to stop it is to put something with sufficient physical resistance in its path. The Velshoth was not that. The Velshoth was a beautiful, sophisticated, elegantly engineered energy absorption system that had absolutely zero interaction with a physical projectile traveling at hypervelocity. The rod would pass through it the way a thrown rock passes through fog. The shield would not register it as a threat. The shield's sensors would not flag it. The shield's response systems would not activate. Because the shield, at its most fundamental level, was looking for energy signatures. And the MK-7's tungsten rod had almost no energy signature. It was a cold, dense, fast-moving piece of metal. The Vithrani had never faced an opponent who'd thought to use it. We had Chapter 5, 11 MONTHS, and then the demand. Source, recovered communications log, TDF IRMES, cross-referenced with Vithrani transmission records. The siege proper began on day 0 of what TDF command designated Operation Standing Ground. The Vithrani moved their fleet into blocking positions. 3 dreadnoughts, 7 cruisers, 14 destroyer-class vessels. They established what they called a compliance perimeter around Velthari Station, which meant that no ship could enter or leave without Vithrani inspection and clearance. Admiral Kotak refused to recognize the perimeter. He continued running supply runs and rotation patrols inside it, ordering TDF vessels to proceed on their standard courses and to respond to any Vithrani interdiction attempts with a recorded protest and a request for coalition arbitration. This was, tactically speaking, a high-wire act. He was betting that the Vithrani wouldn't fire first, that Orith Vaughn would not want to be the one who opened fire on a TDF vessel in front of the coalition's monitoring systems. He was right, Vaughn did not fire. But on day 11, Vaughn escalated. He moved 2 of his dreadnoughts to within 4,000 kilometers of the station itself, close enough that their weapons were in effective engagement range, and he transmitted a new demand, this time not on the station-wide channel, but directly to Admiral Kotak's command frequency. The demand was, evacuate the station within 72 hours or the Vithrani would take it by force. I've read the transcript of that transmission many times. What strikes me every time is the tone. Vaughn wasn't threatening. He wasn't angry. He was, and this is the only word that fits, patient. He sounded the way a teacher sounds when explaining something to a student who's been slow to understand but is showing signs of finally getting it. Of course you'll leave. Because the alternative is unthinkable, and you're rational beings, and rational beings don't choose unthinkable alternatives. Admiral Kotak read the demand. He had his communications officer transmit a response that said, "Request received, 72-hour notice noted, Admiral Kotak." And then he called de la Reyes. Chapter 6, The Call. Source, recovered voice log, TDF IRMES 04-22, 17 GST, day 11 of C. Admiral Kotak, Reyes. De la Reyes, sir. Kotak, you know what the Vithrani are running over there. Reyes, Velshoth MK. IV arrays, sir. Based on the hull geometry of the dreadnoughts and the projector spacing I've been watching on long-range sensors. The IV arrays are their most current generation. They've been testing them for about 18 months. Kotak and Reyes, and they work exactly the way the intelligence assessments say they work, sir. Coherent field diffusion, multi-layer oscillation, the whole package. Anything with an energy signature large enough to damage that hull, they'll absorb it before it gets within 200 meters. Kotak, pause, anything with an energy signature. Reyes, longer pause, Admiral. Kotak, I'm not ordering you to do anything, Reyes. I'm asking you a question. Reyes, pause the MK. 7 is loaded, sir. Has been since day 1, standing protocol for siege conditions. Kotak, what's the probable penetration at current Vithrani positioning? Reyes, sound of movement, possibly pulling up a display at 4,000 kilometers. The rod will be stable. No atmospheric interference in this corridor, good vacuum conditions. Flight time approximately 0.46 seconds. They won't have time to maneuver. And sir. Kotak, go ahead. Reyes, their shields won't see it coming. I've been running simulations since day 3. The Velshoth is looking for energy. Our rod will read as background radiation noise on their sensors. Maybe slightly elevated metallic albedo, but nothing that triggers a threat response in 0.46 seconds. Kotak, very long pause, if I give you a targeting solution. Reyes, I'll take the shot, sir. Kotak, I'm going to try to reach Vaughn one more time. There's something I want to say to him first. Reyes, understood, sir. Kotak, get to your station, and Reyes. Reyes, sir. Kotak, make it count. Chapter 7, VAUN SBAKS. Source, broadcast transmission intercept, Vithrani command frequency, day 11-06-00-00 GST. I want to include the full text of Vaughn's broadcast at the 6-hour mark of day 11, because it's been selectively quoted in a lot of secondary accounts, and the selective quoting misses something important. Full text. Commanders of the Terran Defense Force. This is Supreme Field Commander Oreth Vaughn of the Vithrani Dominion. I address you not as enemies, but as adversaries who have, until this point, conducted yourselves with commendable discipline. That discipline is noted. It will not save you Velthari, but it is noted. I have commanded fleet actions on 9 separate occasions against 7 separate civilizations. In none of those engagements did I face an opponent who chose to hold a position against the Dominion once the full weight of our fleet was present. The wisdom they showed in those moments I do not characterize as cowardice. It was accurate assessment. They looked at what we are, at what our shields represent, at the 2.5 centuries of military history behind them, and they made the rational choice. You have 66 hours remaining. I urge you to make the same rational choice. Our shields are impenetrable. This is not rhetoric. This is not the theater of military posturing. This is an engineering fact that has been demonstrated in combat conditions more times than I can enumerate. Every weapon the galaxy has produced has been tested against us. Every weapon has failed. Your weapons will fail. Your weapons are variations on principles we have already defeated. I say this not to humiliate you. I say it because I want you to understand that this is not a contest. This is physics, and physics does not negotiate. 66 hours, use them wisely. Vaughn out. He believed every word of it. That's what makes the recording so remarkable to listen to now. There's no doubt in his voice, no performative bluster, just the calm, settled certainty of a being who has been invulnerable for his entire career and has no experiential reference point for what it feels like not to be. Admiral Kodak was listening, so was de la Reyes. She said later that when Vaughn said, "Your weapons are variations on principles we have already defeated," she felt something settle inside her. Because he wasn't wrong, she told the debrief team. Everything the Cygnus arm had thrown at them was a variation on the same principles. Directed energy, particle projection, all of it fundamentally the same physics with different wrapping, and the Velshoth handled all of it. She paused. But a railgun isn't a variation on those principles. It's not an upgrade to plasma or an improvement on particle tech. It's completely different physics. Old physics, Earth physics. The kind of physics we were doing back when we were still burning fossil fuels and shooting bullets at each other. Vaughn had never encountered that, and he was so sure he'd seen everything. She said that certainty was his vulnerability. Not the shields. Part 2, the shot. Chapter 8, the fog. Source, personal testimony, Gunnery Sergeant de la Reyes, TDF debrief recording, 23870-315. I already said I wanted to talk about the fog, so let me do that now. I've been at my station for about 2 hours when Admiral Kotak gave me the final authorization. The Mk-7 was mounted in Bay 7, which was a forward-facing weapons bay on the Irmes that had been retrofitted, hastily, about 18 months prior, to accommodate the railgun's magnetic acceleration chamber. The retrofit was adequate but not elegant. There were gaps in the thermal insulation where the original hull fixtures had been removed to make room for the Mk-7's footprint, and those gaps meant that the bay ran cooler than it should have. Combined with the station's cooling vents running parallel to our docked position, the temperature differential at deck level was significant. Hence the fog. It pooled around my boots. It was thin enough that you could see through it, just a low-lying drift of water vapor that caught the bay lighting and turned it slightly opalescent. In another context, a mountain morning, say, or the harbor back in Batangas on certain winter days, it would have been beautiful. In Bay 7 on day 11, it was just cold. My crew was 4 people. Corporal Mike van den Berg on charging systems, Specialist First Class Jaehoon Cho on targeting integration, Lance Corporal Amara Osai on structural monitoring. Railgun discharge put significant stress on the mounting brackets, and someone had to watch those gauges and myself at the primary operator console. We'd been running readiness drills since day 3, not simulations. Actual power-up sequences, actual targeting calibration, actual charging cycles run to 90% and then held. We knew exactly how the Mk-7 felt at every stage of its operation. We knew what the vibration through the deck meant at each power level. We knew the particular sound, not loud, actually. More of a dense, physical hum that you felt in your sternum more than heard with your ears, that the magnetic acceleration chamber made when it was running at full charge. We knew what we had. We were ready. When the authorization came through at 06:44:22, it wasn't dramatic. Kodak's voice on the comm channel, "Reyes, you have targeting solution Kappa 7 and authorization to fire at your discretion. Confirm." I confirmed. I looked at my crew. Van den Berg was already at her console. Cho had the targeting integration live. Osai was watching the bracket gauges with the expression of someone who had made peace with what was about to happen to the structural members under their supervision. I said, "Final system check." We ran it. 67 seconds, everything green. I said, "Targeting Kappa 7. The targeting solution that Cho and I had been refining since day 3 was the forward shield projector housing on the lead Vithrani dreadnought, the one we designated VDN Alpha in our tracking logs. The projector housing was, physically, a different material composition than the main hull, slightly less dense. The reason we'd chosen it wasn't because it was weaker, it wasn't particularly, but because hitting it would create a secondary effect. Destroy a shield projector housing, and you create a gap in the Velshoth coverage. A gap that persists for the time it takes them to reroute field generation to adjacent projectors, which, according to the engineering specs TDF Intelligence had pulled from Coalition archives, was somewhere between 9 and 14 seconds. 9 to 14 seconds of open hull, no shield. The TDF cruisers watching from the flanking positions had their weapons locked and waiting for exactly that window. The shot itself was not for destruction. The shot was for opening. Chapter 9, The Moment. Source, personal testimony, Gunnery Sergeant de la Reyes. I want to be accurate about what it feels like to take a shot with the Mk7. People imagine it as dramatic. They imagine noise or a visible beam or some kind of visual spectacle. That's what energy weapons give you: visible light, visible discharge, the drama of coherent energy crossing space. The Mk7 doesn't give you any of that. What you get is a sound, that sternal hum building for about 3 seconds during the final acceleration phase, and then a very sharp mechanical crack as the magnetic containment releases. That crack is not what movies would call an explosion. It's more like something very large clearing its throat. Decisive, blunt, done. And then the rod is gone. You can't see it. It's traveling at 8.7 kilometers per second, and it's 94 centimeters of dark metal against a black field. It's gone before your eye has time to register it left. What you can see if your targeting display is configured correctly, and ours is the Mk7's onboard terminal sensor tracking the rod's flight path. At 4,000 kilometers, the flight time was 0.46 seconds. In Mk7 terms, that's a relatively close shot. The telemetry was clean, stable vacuum, no interference. I watched the tracking display. 0.46 seconds is not a long time. I think I held my breath for most of it. What I remember most clearly, and I've tried to describe this a dozen times and never felt like I got it exactly right, is not the moment of impact. It's the moment just before. The 0.3 second mark, approximately. The rod is 2/3 of the way across the distance. The Vithrani sensors haven't flagged anything. Our own sensors are showing their standard emissions. No alert signatures, no shield adjustment sequences, nothing that indicates they've detected the incoming projectile. They're just sitting there. 2.5 centuries of impenetrability. The most advanced coherent field shielding in the Cygnus arm. And in about 0.16 seconds, a 26-kilogram piece of tungsten carbide machined in a manufacturing facility in the lunar highlands is going to demonstrate definitively that impenetrable is always conditional. Impenetrable to what? The Vithrani hadn't asked that question carefully enough. We had. Chapter 10, Impact. Source, Sensor Log Reconstruction, TDF IRMES, cross-referenced with Vithrani damage assessment records obtained post-engagement. The rod struck the forward shield projector housing a VDN alpha at 06:45:56, 22 GST, day 11 of the Velthari siege. Impact velocity, 8.61 kilometers per second, minor deceleration from residual particulate in the corridor, within expected parameters. The Velshoth field registered 0 response. The shield sensor systems recorded the projectile's passage as a minor metallic albedo fluctuation, background noise, essentially. No threat response was initiated. No shield hardening sequence engaged. The rod passed through the outermost field layer, the second field layer, the third, and the fourth without any of them doing anything at all to slow it. The kinetic energy delivered to the projector housing, approximately 964 megajoules. To provide physical context for that number, the projector housing was rated to withstand directed energy impacts of up to 400 megajoules in its design specifications. Those specifications had been written assuming the relevant threat was coherent electromagnetic energy, which the housing's armor composites were reasonably good at redirecting. They were not written to account for 964 megajoules of kinetic force, distributed across a 3.2 centimeter contact point in approximately 0.004 seconds. The housing didn't fail, that's not the right word. It was erased. The rod punched through the housing, through the primary projector assembly behind it, through the secondary coolant manifold, through the internal structural support member that connected the projector mount to the hull frame. And because 964 megajoules doesn't stop at the first thing it hits, continued into the interior of the dreadnought's forward hull section for another 14 meters before kinetic energy dissipation and structural material resistance finally brought it to a halt. The projector housing ceased to exist as a functional unit in approximately 12 milliseconds. The Velshoth coverage gap opened at 06:45:56, 23 GST. The TDF cruisers fired at 06:45:56, 31 GST. 8/100ths of a second, that's all the time they needed. Because they'd been waiting, weapons locked, fingers metaphorically speaking ready since day 3. The gap remained open for 11.7 seconds before VDN Alpha's field management systems rerouted. In that 11.7 seconds, 7 plasma lance discharges struck the dreadnought's exposed hull in the forward quadrant. Plasma lance hits on unshielded Vithrani armor, penetration depth 8 to 14 centimeters per discharge. Hull thickness in that section, approximately 22 centimeters. After 7 hits, the forward section of VDN Alpha's hull had structural integrity failure in an 80-meter radius around the original impact point. Emergency bulkhead sealed. Atmosphere venting stopped, but the forward sections of the dreadnought were non-functional. Weapons systems in that quadrant, offline. Propulsion coupling to the forward maneuvering thrusters, offline. Shield projectors in the entire forward hemisphere, reduced to 60% coverage. From invulnerable to critically damaged in 12.1 seconds. Not because the TDF had done anything that the Vithrani hadn't seen before. Not because our plasma lances were better than anyone else's. Because Delas Rays had opened a door with a piece of tungsten carbide, and once the door was open, the physics were simple. Chapter 11, VAUNS Reaction. Source, Vithrani Command Channel Intercept 06:46:10 GST Day 11. The Vithrani Command Channel went through several distinct phases in the seconds after impact. Phase 1, 03 seconds, complete silence. Not communication silence, the channel remained open. The crew of VDN Alpha continued transmitting, but there was nothing coherent, just fragments, alert tones, automated damage control announcements in Vithrani. The kinds of sounds a ship makes when something has happened to it that its systems do not have a prepared response for. Phase 2, 38 seconds, damage assessment traffic. Officers on VDN Alpha attempting to characterize what had happened. The phrases appearing in the intercept logs are in translation. Shield failure, forward quadrant, unclear mechanism, and projector assembly destroyed, no energy signature on impact record, and most tellingly, weapon type unidentified. Weapon type unidentified. 240 years of combat experience. An encyclopedic database of every weapons system deployed by every civilization in the Cygnus arm. And VDN Alpha's sensor teams couldn't tell their command what had hit them. Phase 3, 8 seconds onward, Orith Vaughn himself. The intercept translation reads, "This is VAUN, report. Sir, forward section damage, hull breach contained. Shield forward coverage at 60%. Mechanism of initial strike, pause, we are not certain, sir. Not certain, clarify. The initial impact. Our shield sensors showed no energy weapon discharge, no particle emission, no coherent field. The projector housing was destroyed by... Sir, the best analysis we have right now is a physical projectile. A solid object. Long pause. A physical projectile. Yes, sir. Longer pause. The Terrans are using kinetic ordnance. It appears so, sir. Very long pause. You can hear something on the recording that might be a quiet vocalization, not words, just a sound. The Vithrani equivalent of a sharp intake of breath, perhaps. Get me casualty figures and structural assessment, and recalculate firing solutions, all vessels. I want our secondary weapons online immediately. Yes, sir. Pause, then quieter, almost to himself. Kinetic, of course it's kinetic. That last line, of course it's kinetic. I've listened to the recording 40 times. The translation is accurate. I've had it reviewed by 3 separate xenolinguistics teams. But the emotional content of those 3 Vithrani words is harder to pin down. It doesn't sound like anger. It doesn't sound like fear. It sounds, and I want to be careful here because I'm describing the emotional register of an alien intelligence. It sounds like the sound a brilliant person makes when they realize they've overlooked something obvious. That particular quality of self-directed recognition. Of course. 240 years of energy weapons. 240 years of shield technology tuned against energy weapons. 240 years of facing opponents who all made the same fundamental assumption that the most advanced weaponry was energy-based, and that the way to defeat a shield was to overwhelm it on its own terms. Nobody had ever tried not doing that. We had. Of course it's kinetic. Part 3 after the shot. Chapter 12, the 11 seconds that changed everything. Source, TDF Battle Damage Assessment, compiled post-engagement, 23870-305. Let me lay out what happened in the fleet engagement that followed, because it moved fast, and the summary versions in most public accounts compress it in ways that lose important texture. 06:45:56 Railgun Impact, Shield Gap opens. 06:45:56 to 06:46, 08 TDF Cruisers Perseverance and Dakar engage with plasma lances. 7 hits on exposed hull of VDN Alpha as detailed above. 06:46, 08 VDN Alpha's Velshoth reroutes. Coverage restored to 60%. 06:46, 09 Orith Vaughn orders general engagement. All Vithrani vessels begin maneuvering to attack formation. Admiral Kotak orders station defense protocols. TDF vessels establish defensive perimeter around Velthari Station. Remaining 2 TDF cruisers and 2 frigates move to flanking positions. 06:46:15 Vaughn encounters the second problem. The second problem was not de la Rey's, it was what the Mk-7's first shot had done to Vaughn's tactical calculus. Before the shot, Vaughn had a simple equation. His shields were impenetrable, therefore he had freedom of maneuver, therefore he could position his vessels for maximum offensive effect without meaningfully worrying about incoming fire. His vessels could close range, select optimal firing positions, take their time. The shield was a constant, an assumption so reliable it didn't need to factor into tactical decision-making any more than gravity does for someone walking on a planet. After the shot, the shield was no longer a constant. Vaughn didn't know how many kinetic railguns we had. He knew we had at least one. VDN Alpha's sensor data had confirmed the approximate impact velocity and projectile characteristics. But did we have 2, 5, 10? Could we fire again immediately, or was there a reload interval? If he maneuvered his vessels aggressively, were the other vessels vulnerable to the same attack? He didn't know, and the uncertainty changed everything. A general who's been operating with the certainty of impenetrable shields, suddenly facing kinetic threat assessment, is not a general who can fight the way he's trained to fight. Every maneuver now had to account for possible railgun targeting solutions. Every aggressive move was also a potentially exposed flank. The tactical space that had been, moments before, fully owned by Vithrani offensive doctrine had suddenly become complicated. Vaughn made a defensible choice under the circumstances. He pulled back. He ordered VDN Alpha to reduce engagement range, moved his other dreadnoughts to maximize mutual shield overlaps, compensating for the partial coverage on VDN Alpha by using adjacent vessels to cover its weakened sectors, and ordered his cruiser force to form a screen rather than proceeding with the assault. It was a reasonable response to an uncertainty he hadn't anticipated. It was also exactly what Admiral Kotak had hoped for. Because Kotak hadn't been trying to destroy the Vithrani fleet, he'd been trying to create hesitation, to demonstrate that the equation Vaughn was operating on was wrong, to force Vaughn into the uncomfortable position of fighting an opponent who had something he'd never planned against. The hesitation was the victory. Chapter 13, 47 minutes. Source, written testimony, Admiral Yusuf Kotak, submitted 23870-401. The full fleet engagement lasted 47 minutes. I want to be precise about what engagement means in that context, because it wasn't 47 minutes of continuous intensive combat. It was 47 minutes of maneuvering, positioning, exchanges of fire at varying intensity, and increasingly, communication. On my side, TDF vessels holding defensive positions, returning fire when fired upon and waiting. On Vaughn's side, Vithrani vessels probing the perimeter, testing our defensive responses, and dealing with the cascading problem of recalibrating their tactical doctrine in real time. Rays fired twice more during those 47 minutes. The second shot came at the 9-minute mark, when one of Vaughn's cruiser-class vessels attempted to close range on our port flank, close enough to support VDN Alpha's damaged shield sector. Rays had the targeting solution calculated before I gave the order, which tells you something about her. The second rod struck the cruiser's maneuvering thruster housing. Not a shield gap opening this time, just raw kinetic damage to propulsion systems. The cruiser lost 30% of its forward maneuvering capacity and broke off its approach. The third shot came at the 22-minute mark. I won't detail the exact target here because there's an ongoing engineering assessment of the Vithrani vessel involved. Suffice to say, it created another shield gap, and the TDF cruisers on that flank used it. And by minute 25, the Vithrani fleet was operating with 2 significantly damaged dreadnoughts and 1 effectively immobile cruiser. At minute 31, Vaughn requested a communication channel. I opened one. He said, and this is from the intercept log, "You are using kinetic systems." I said, "Yes." He said, "We have no effective counter to kinetic penetration at these velocities within our current deployment." I said, "I know." He said, "You planned this." I said, "We've been planning since day 3. There was a pause. He said, "I underestimated you." I said, "No, you underestimated the question impenetrable to what? General, I have no interest in destroying your fleet. I have considerable interest in keeping Velthari Station under Terran Defense Force authority. Can we discuss that?" Another pause. He said, "Yes, we can discuss it." Engagement effectively ceased within 6 minutes of that exchange. Formal ceasefire was established at minute 47. I have read several accounts that describe what happened at Velthari as a battle. That framing isn't wrong exactly. But what it really was, from my perspective in real time, was a demonstration. We demonstrated something about the nature of impenetrability, and Vaughn, to his credit, was intelligent enough to learn from it. Chapter 14, In the Bay. Source, personal testimony, Gunnery Sergeant de la Reyes. After the third shot, I sat down on the deck. Not dramatically, not intentionally. My legs just found the floor on their own, and I sat there in the fog. It was still there, still drifting around at ankle level, and I looked at the Mk-7. It's a big machine, 14.6 meters in the acceleration chamber alone. Gray-blue metal casing, slightly discolored around the magnetic coil housings from heat cycles. The rod-loading mechanism had a hydraulic arm that swung out during reload, and after the third shot it was resting in its parked position at about my head height, pointing toward the ceiling. It looked, honestly, kind of unglamorous. For a weapon that had just done what it had done, it was a very unassuming piece of hardware. No glowing components, no dramatic energy emissions, just metal and magnets and physics. Cho sat down beside me. He didn't say anything. Van den Berg stayed at her console because she's not really a floor-sitting type. Osa was scribbling notes in his bracket stress log. The discharge cycles had put more load on the forward mounts than projected, and he was already calculating what we'd need to document for the engineering debrief. I looked at the bay, I looked at the fog. I thought about General Vaughn and his 2.5 centuries of invulnerability. I thought about the word impenetrable and how it only means anything in relation to what you've actually tried. Impenetrable to energy, impenetrable to particles, impenetrable to every sophisticated weapons system that 600 years of Cygnus arm civilization had developed. Just not impenetrable to a 26-kilogram piece of tungsten going very fast. I thought that's the thing about physics. You can master it perfectly in every domain you've ever encountered and still be surprised by a domain you haven't. Cho said after a while, "You okay, Sarge?" I said, "Yeah, just thinking." He said, "About what?" I said, "About how certainty is the most expensive thing a general can afford." He nodded. He didn't ask me to elaborate. I liked that about him. Part 4, The Aftermath. Chapter 15, What VAUN wrote. Source, Vithrani Dominion Internal Dispatch, obtained through post-engagement intelligence exchange, translated by TDF Xenolinguistics Division. After the ceasefire, Supreme Field Commander Orith Vaughn filed an after-action report with Vithrani Dominion Command. The document is 47 pages in the original Vithrani script. I've read the full translation. What I want to include here is the section that has been, in various forms, widely circulated since it became part of the intelligence exchange record. The relevant passage in translation. The human forces at Velthari employed a kinetic projectile weapon of a type not present in our threat assessment database. The weapon's fundamental operating principle, mass acceleration, via electromagnetic means, with no coherent energy emission during flight, renders it effectively invisible to our Velshoth detection systems. The impact energy at the tested range was sufficient to cause catastrophic structural failure to any unshielded hull section, and more significantly, to any shield projector assembly, which is necessarily constructed to different tolerances than primary hull armor. The implications of this are significant and require immediate doctrinal revision. For 240 years, our shield technology has defined our military doctrine. We have built our threat assessments, our tactical formations, our strategic assumptions, and I must acknowledge this, our institutional psychology around the premise that our shields provide comprehensive protection against hostile action. This premise was accurate within the threat environment we understood. The threat environment we understood was incomplete. I do not fault our engineers, who built what they understood to be a comprehensive system. I do not fault our intelligence services, who cataloged every known weapons technology in the Cygnus arm and found no significant kinetic threat. I fault, instead, our collective assumption that the question, impenetrable, was answerable without asking, impenetrable to what? The humans asked that question. They answered it with a piece of dense metal and several months of preparation. We lost Velthari not because they outfought us. We lost it because they outthought us, in a dimension we had not considered. This distinction matters because outfighting can be countered with better weapons and stronger formations. Outthinking requires a different response. Recommendation: complete reassessment of Velshoth threat modeling to include non-energy kinetic vectors. Estimated timeline: 14 months. During this period, our fleet posture should be considered strategically defensive in all theaters where Terran Defense Force assets are present. Further recommendation: reevaluate the cultural weight we have placed on the concept of the untouched surface. 240 years is a long time to be undefeated. Long enough, perhaps, to mistake good fortune and good technology for something more absolute. We are not untouched. We are merely, until recently, unchallengeable in the domains we chose to contest. The humans chose a different domain. Next time, we should be the ones choosing. I've read a lot of after-action reports. Military documents are not, in general, known for their philosophical depth. Orith Vaughn's was different. Chapter 16, What the Station Felt Like After. Source, written account, Corporal Mark van den Berg. Submitted for inclusion in Personal Record 23870-228. I'm not the one who fired the railgun. Delaz the one who gets the medals and the interviews and the documentary requests. I was on charging systems, which is a fancy way of saying I made sure the capacitor banks were sequenced correctly and the power draw didn't exceed what the IRMEs could sustain during discharge. It's important work, it's not glamorous work. But I was there, in Bay 7, in the fog. And I want to say something about what it was like when it was over. When the ceasefire was confirmed, there was a moment, maybe 20-30 seconds, where nobody in Bay 7 said anything. Not silence like the silence before a shot, where everyone's holding something tightly inside themselves. A different kind of silence. The kind that happens when something that has been held taut for a very long time finally releases. The Vithrani had been outside the station for 11 months. 11 months of siege conditions. 11 months of running patrols inside a Vithrani compliance perimeter. 11 months of Admiral Kotak sending reports to Coalition Command and Coalition Command asking him to moderate his language. 11 months of watching 3 dreadnoughts and 14 destroyers sit there like an unanswerable argument about who this station belonged to. We'd answered it, with physics and preparation, and a woman sitting on the deck of Bay 7 thinking about the nature of certainty. I looked at Delau on the floor, and she looked tired in the specific way that isn't about sleep. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something important for a long time and finally putting it down. I said, "You know they're going to make a documentary about this." She said, "God, I hope not." I said, "You fired a railgun through an alien general's invincible shield and won a siege. They're definitely making a documentary." She said, "If they ask me what I was thinking when I took the shot, I'm going to say I was thinking about the fog." I said, "The fog." She said it was beautiful. I looked at the mist still pooling around the deck equipment. In the aftermath of everything, the discharge cycles, the heat from the capacitors, whatever chemical processes my own body had been running for the past 40 minutes, I'd stopped noticing it. But she was right, it was beautiful. Cold, low, quietly drifting. Completely indifferent to Vithrani dreadnoughts and kinetic railguns and 2.5 centuries of invulnerability. Just water vapor in a temperature gradient. Just physics. Chapter 17, What Happened to VAUN? Source, Public Record, Vithrani Dominion, supplemented by Coalition diplomatic correspondence. Orith Vaughn was not relieved of command after Velthari. This surprised a lot of people in TDF command who expected the Vithrani Dominion to make an example of him. That's not what happened. Instead, Vaughn's after-action report, the 47-page document excerpted above, circulated through Vithrani Dominion military command at the highest levels. It was debated. It was argued over. And then, according to coalition diplomatic sources, it became something remarkably close to a foundational document for the Vithrani military reform process that began approximately 3 months after Velthari. Vaughn was assigned to lead that reform process. He spent the next 2 years overseeing the complete redesign of Vithrani threat assessment doctrine. The Velshoth shield system was substantially rebuilt, not abandoned, because it was still effective against energy weapons, but rebuilt with kinetic threat detection capability. New shield projector housings were armored against kinetic penetration to a standard that the redesigned shields could reinforce. He also, according to sources with access to Vithrani Dominion internal communications, established a new training curriculum for Vithrani fleet commanders that began with a single question that all students were required to answer in writing before any other instruction. Impenetrable to what? That question is now in the curriculum. At Velthari, it was the question they hadn't asked. I find something almost moving about that. Chapter 18, The Medals. Source, TDF Personnel Record, Gunnery Sergeant de la Reyes. She got the Terran Defense Cross, first class. That's the second highest combat decoration the TDF awards. There was significant discussion, I understand, about whether it should have been the highest, the Solar Medal of Valor, but the Solar Medal requires an act that was, in the specific language of the award statute, in direct defense of Terran life against an assault already in progress, and the Velthari shot had been, technically, preemptive. I want to register here, for the historical record, that this distinction strikes me as the kind of bureaucratic hair-splitting that would be funny if it weren't also slightly infuriating. De la Reyes accepted the cross with characteristic understatement. At the award ceremony, which was held aboard the Irmes with Admiral Kotak officiating, the Admiral asked her, as is traditional, if she wanted to say a few words. She thought about it for a moment. She said, "The shot worked because we asked a question that the Vithrani had stopped asking. We should never stop asking it. Whatever we're sure about, impenetrable, unbeatable, guaranteed, we should ask to what, and against what, and under what conditions, because certainty is expensive and it tends to charge interest." She paused. "That's all I've got." Admiral Kotak said that was more than sufficient. The crew of Bay 7, Van Denberg Cho Osai, received commendation medals and were written into the unit citation. Cho framed his. Van Denberg put hers in a drawer somewhere and then spent 3 weeks looking for it when she needed it for a transfer application. Os had his mounted next to his bracket stress engineering logs from the engagement because he said they were thematically connected. Nobody made a documentary. Van Denberg was wrong about that, or at least wrong about the timing. There's reportedly one in development. De la has declined to participate. Part 5, The Questions. Chapter 19, What It Means. Source, analysis submitted by Dr. Priya Meenakshisundaram, TDF Strategic Studies Division, 23870-512. I was asked to provide a strategic analysis of the Velthari engagement for inclusion in this historical record. I'll do that, but I want to start with something that isn't strategic. I want to start with the fact that this battle was decided by a technology that is, by contemporary standards, primitive. The kinetic railgun is not a new concept. Humans were theorizing about electromagnetic mass acceleration in the 20th century, Earth Common Era. We built the first functional naval railguns in the early 21st century. The basic technology, magnets, conductive rails, solid projectile, is simple enough that it's taught in introductory physics courses. The Mk-7KRS is sophisticated in its engineering tolerances and materials science, but its fundamental operating principle is something a 20th century physicist would recognize immediately. It is not, by any measure, the most advanced weapon in the TDF arsenal. It is not advanced at all by Cygnus arms standards. That's why it worked. The Vethrani Threat Assessment Database, which has been partially shared with TDF intelligence as part of the post-Velthari Cooperative Agreement, cataloged 112 distinct weapons technologies used by civilizations across the Cygnus arm. Of those 112, 109 were variations on directed energy, particle projection, or field manipulation. 3 were classified as kinetic ballistic. Of those 3, the highest recorded kinetic weapon velocity was 0.8 kilometers per second, a gaseous propellant projectile used by a pre-FTL civilization that the Vethrani had encountered 3 centuries ago and incorporated into their historical records as a technological curiosity. The Mk-7 fires at 8.7 kilometers per second. The Vethrani threat assessment had kinetic weapons. They just hadn't seen anything like the Mk-7. And because the category existed in their records, filed under primitive, pre-civilizational technology, no current threat, they hadn't updated it in 150 years. This is, I would argue, one of the most important strategic lessons of the Velthari engagement, the danger of categories. Once you've labeled something primitive or outdated or no longer relevant, you stop monitoring it. You stop updating your assessment. You assume the category will remain what it was when you first filed it, and categories have a way of surprising you. Humanity had good reasons to keep developing kinetic weapons alongside energy-based systems. Some of those reasons were budgetary. Kinetic ordnance is dramatically cheaper to manufacture than directed energy systems at equivalent destructive capacity. Some were doctrinal. Our military doctrine had never fully abandoned kinetic systems because they were effective against certain target types that energy weapons handled poorly. Some were, frankly, cultural. There's a strain of military thought in TDF doctrine that distrusts over-reliance on any single weapons paradigm, a reflex that comes from studying enough military history to know that every paradigm eventually meets its counter. We didn't develop the Mk-7 specifically to fight the Vethrani. We didn't develop it with the Velshoth in mind. We developed it because kinetic weapons work, and we'd learn not to abandon things that work just because newer things also work. The Vethrani stopped using kinetic weapons because they were superseded by energy systems. That decision made sense at the time and in the context of their own strategic environment. It just left a gap in their threat modeling. We fit into that gap.